When you imagine science, what do you visualize in your mind? Perhaps you think of people working in a lab with test tubes and beakers. Or maybe you think of students dissecting frogs in a biology class or a physicist performing calculations. This lesson looks at how philosophers define science and how they differ in their views of what it really is. We'll hear from the perspectives of 4 influential thinkers. By the end of our lesson, you'll better understand what is meant by the philosophy of science, an approach that looks at how we define science, how science works, and how we build scientific knowledge. First up is Karl Popper. Popper would want you to know the meaning of the term falsifiable. This refers to the possibility of proving a statement to be false. Popper argues that scientific knowledge must be falsifiable, meaning that there must be at least the potential to disprove a theory with an observation that would contradict it. Let's look at this more closely with an example. First, consider the claim, "There is no Bigfoot living in the Pacific Northwest." There is the potential to prove it false if we were able to obtain new information, such as capturing Bigfoot. So this can be considered a scientific claim. Now consider the claim, "Bigfoot lives in the Pacific Northwest." There is no real way to disprove this, to determine it is 100% false. We could comb the region looking for Bigfoot in an exhaustive search, but we can't say without a doubt that the statement is false. Therefore, the claim that Bigfoot exists is not in the realm of science from Popper's point of view. According to his philosophy, science can only ever be about topics that have the potential to be proven wrong. Everything else is not science at all. This is a clear-cut rule that can be used to see the difference, he says. You can remember Popper's name by thinking of how he saw it as important to be able to pop the bubble of belief in a claim to have the potential to prove it wrong. Thomas Kuhn is up next. He's more of a historian of science, looking at how science has developed over time. A key term to know for Kuhn is the phrase paradigm shift. Paradigm shifts occur when old scientific theories are questioned by a revolutionary new approach, and a new framework is developed for assessing scientific knowledge. For example, consider a time when people thought the Earth was the center of the universe. During this period of time, science was based on certain standards and ideas, while later these concepts had to be completely revised to adjust to the new understanding of the Sun being at the center of our solar system. You can remember Kuhn's name by thinking of the word cool. In a way, Kuhn recognized that sometimes cool new ideas would completely change the nature of how we think about science. Now let's turn to Paul Feyerabend, who is definitely not convinced that there is any one standard approach that can get to the truth. He proposes that science as we know it is not as objective as it presents itself to be. He argues that the scientific method is not particularly valuable at all. Feyerabend was interested in completely bending the rules of how we think about science, turning the approach on its head. He questions whether the scientific method really produces useful results at all compared to any other method. Our final philosopher to consider is Helen Longino. Longino acknowledges that scientists each have their own assumptions and beliefs that influence how they present and argue their claims. Yes, this makes them less than objective. Yet there is a way to get to a more objective science. She argues that this is why we need forums in society for criticizing and questioning what is claimed by scientific communities. For instance, imagine a small group of scientists with similar backgrounds reviewing one another's work. They may fail to notice some assumptions in one another's work, but when you have a diverse community reviewing their work, they can help uncover these assumptions. This forum can help determine if the scientific claim is still acceptable or if it needs reworking. Think of Longino's perspective as one that acknowledges science at its best is a combination or combo of many viewpoints that help temper one another to get closer to the truth. The philosophy of science is an approach that looks at how we define science, how science works, and how we build scientific knowledge. Some philosophers, like Karl Popper, argue that a statement is only scientific if it is falsifiable. This is a rule, he says, that can be used to distinguish between science and non-science. Thomas Kuhn points out how the standards used in science can be altered over time when there are paradigm shifts from one way of thinking to another. Paul Feyerabend questions the scientific method altogether, arguing that it is not objective and may be no better than any other method. Helen Longino, on the other hand, sees value in science that gains objectivity from public scrutiny and criticism. The process helps bring forth the assumptions of those making claims.